Hey guys, Mr. Hyatt here. This is the Chapter 4 lecture over biodiversity and evolution. We start out this chapter looking at a case study, like always. This one is dealing with amphibians and how we can use them as an indicator of species. So, since amphibians live in both water and land, they are going to pick up a lot of toxins if toxins are out there anywhere. So, you see on the screen here, many of our populations have either declined or vanished since 1980. 1980, what happened in 1980? It's not like that's the beginning of the Industrial Revolution or something like that. But we did see an increase in carbon dioxide emissions starting in the late 70s, early 80s. So it appears to be a combination of all the fun stuff that we're dealing with as a population. Like I said, they do serve as biological indicators, so we can see when something is wrong, when amphibians start to die. They also are huge in the food web. And also, of course, selfish humans, we care about medicine. So we get a lot of our medicines from amphibians. So what we're dealing with in this chapter is largely biodiversity and the ways that evolution contributed to and sustained biodiversity. So kind of some vocab. Diversity of life, because it's biodiversity. We may be talking about any number of types of diversity, and we'll talk more about those later. Biodiversity is absolutely one of our 3 scientific factors of sustainability. That's something your book ties back to a lot. So kind of one of the key tenets and key parts of this course. Type of diversity number 1. If you're making an outline, you've got biodiversity as letter I, you've got species diversity as number 1. Essentially, we're talking about the different numbers of species in an ecosystem. We have identified about 2 million species, but we're nowhere close to the total number of species on Earth. There are estimates 5 million. I've seen estimates, like it says on the screen, 7 to 10. I've seen some close to 100 million. That's might seem like a lot, but there's a lot of the ocean depths that we haven't explored. There are a lot of remote areas in rainforests that we haven't explored in detail. People certainly have been there, but we haven't assessed them in terms of what species are there, what species are hiding inside of trees, what species are hiding underground, all those types of things. Next component of biodiversity is genetic diversity. That's essentially going to be what's in your gene pool. How many different alleles do you have out there on one given trait? You guys know lots about genetics, or you wouldn't be in this class. But essentially, your gene pool is a total accumulation of all alleles in a population. Here's an example of a variety of genes. You can see these. They're snails. They're Cuban snails. But you can see they have different banding patterns. That's a genetic trait. The color is also a genetic trait. So we've got a lot of diversity in this one slide, in this one picture. A lot of different banding patterns, a lot of different colors. So this species would be said to have a lot of genetic diversity. More diversity is always a good thing. Ecosystem diversity is component 3. So that's going to be how many different ecosystems are in an area. So we know about biomes. We know we're in the deciduous forest. But what does that mean? How diverse is our deciduous forest? Are we just a forest, or do we also have hills and grasslands and caves and things along those lines? We know here in central Indiana we have, I think, about 12 different ecosystems within our deciduous forest biome. So that's obviously going to impact the type of life that can be in a biome. It's going to impact the variety of life. It's going to impact the species diversity and by extension, the genetic diversity. Component 4, functional diversity. This, once upon a time, was just described as niche variety. It's now been rolled into one of our types of biodiversity, I think just to streamline things. But we're talking about your role in your ecosystem, And if you define the word niche as freshmen, that's what we're talking about. If more than one species shares the same function, shares the same niche, we're going to have competition. And we're going to have somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. So we're gearing towards and heading towards evolution. That this is just a component of that. Notice that second bullet point. Sorry, I'm struggling with my voice today. A second bullet point, if an ecosystem contains many species that share functional traits, that ecosystem will be better able to withstand some species loss without losing functionality. That's a really big idea in biology, and it's one that a lot of teachers, including myself, struggle to get across to students. And the idea is, if you've got a lot of different species in an area and there's a natural disaster or there's some sort of a change, there's a good chance that at least one of those types of species will survive, or a few of them will survive. Maybe not all, but a few. If you have very low diversity, whether it's genetic diversity, species diversity, functional, it doesn't matter. If you have very low diversity, you've got a greater chance that the change will wipe out all life in the area. Sort of what I talked about on the last slide. The more diverse your ecosystem is, the more likely you are going to be able to handle changes in the environment. Biodiversity absolutely builds natural capital. Natural capital is, basically the stuff that we pull out of the ecosystem. If we have very little biodiversity, we're not going to be able to get a lot of stuff. We're going to get one type of food. We're going to get one type of medicine. We're going to get one type of building materials. We can make structures out of wood, but no bamboo because we don't have any bamboo available, things like that. Certainly our ecosystem services improve because with diversity, we get different requirements for life. We get some organisms that need lots of nitrogen, some organisms that fix nitrogen and put nitrogen back into the soil. So again, it lets or allows more ecosystem services to happen just because we have a broader need, broader range of stuff. And then it allows for evolution of new species because we're fitting in new niches and we're changing as we go. So what roles do species play? It's kind of some vocab here. There's a lot of vocab here early on. Your niche is your role. Your habitat is where you live. So your niche is what you do. Your habitat is your job, is your address. There are two types. We've got broad and we've got narrow niches. We'll talk more about those here in just a second. But yeah, your niche is kind of a hard thing to understand. It's your role in an ecosystem. That's kind of tough. What is a tree's role in an ecosystem? Is it photosynthesis? Is it removing carbon dioxide? Is it providing homes for owls? It can be a tough concept to nail down or define. Getting back to the niches, broad range and narrow range. Things that are broad, we call generalists because they can generally survive anywhere. They're going to eat a wide variety of foods, live in a wide range of environments, and there's certainly more competition because you can eat everything. So you're going to be fighting over everything. And you are less prone to extinction because if you run out of one type of food, you tend to move on to another. And I'm focusing on foods, but we're also talking about range of environments. We're talking about abiotic factors. Generalists basically can survive anywhere. Humans kind of would fall under that category. Specialists have narrow niches. They can only eat a few or maybe only one thing. They can only live in a really narrow range of habitats. They can't live everywhere. There's less competition because they are so specialized. But you're more prone to extinction because if you can only eat one thing and that goes away, kind of out of luck. Here's a graph that shows that. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but this has popped up on old AP exams. We're talking about resource use along the bottom, number of individuals. You see where you've got niche overlap, so there's going to be some competition there, things along those lines. This picture comes from your book. One of the ways that life in general reduces competition is through specialization. And I know you can't really read this. Make sure you check into your book. Sorry, I don't have the page number right off the top of my head, but essentially the idea is these birds occupy specialized feeding niches. So they're not fighting over the same food. They've kind of divided it up. You take this part, you take this part, I'll take this part. We'll eat what's in our area, and we'll move on. Piggybacking off of this is the idea of invasive species and non-native species. We'll talk more about this later in the week. But essentially, it's, are you from here or did you move into here? Invasive species you see down at the bottom are really dangerous because they outcompete and displace native species. They outcompete them because they have no predators, like it says at the bottom. So there's no, you're at a disadvantage if you're a native species because something already eats you. And if somebody moves in that occupies your same niche, they have no threats, so they can focus on gathering food and surviving and making babies. They tend to spread rapidly if they get into a good place. Some that you might have heard of here in central Indiana are like the Asian carp. That's a big one for us. Zebra mussels are a big one. You probably talked about that in Biology 1. Goby fish, kudzu is an example of an invasive plant. There are lots and lots of examples. They tend to test over those. Okay, another kind of vocab term is a keystone species. It's called the keystone because they're kind of the most important species in a food web. That's an old architecture term. The keystone is what holds up the building. So an ecosystem would be dramatically different if that keystone species disappeared. So a lot of times we're talking about apex predators, things that are at the top of the food chain. You can imagine if sharks disappeared, how that would impact the ocean, or if lions disappeared, how that would impact everything down the food web and down the food chain. Can definitely cause population crashes and extinction of dependent species if that one goes away. So again, just a factor that impacts biodiversity. An example of that is the American alligator. It's a keystone species in subtropical wetland ecosystems in the southeastern U.S. Places we have alligators, Florida, Alabama a little bit. You see that these gator holes provide fresh water and habitat for aquatic life. They're nesting and feeding sites for other species. They dig, and that maintains the balance of vegetation, controls predatory fish. So they do a lot for the ecosystem. But they're also big and scary and have lots of teeth, so we hunt them. They've been an endangered species until 1987. We protected them, and they've recovered. But now they're being threatened by invasive pythons that people have bought as pets, and they've either escaped or people have turned them loose. And there's a real python epidemic in the Everglades. Sharks are another example. They maintain marine environments. Over 1 million are killed every year in response to way over-exaggerated media reports on sharks. Look up how many people die to shark attacks compared to how many sharks die to people attacks. We're winning that battle. Populations of many species are sharply declining due to finning. So I'm not sure what this disagreement is here. Over 1 million and as many as 73 million are killed annually. So that's significantly over 1 million. 25% of the world's open ocean sharks are threatened. They're definitely vulnerable because they don't reproduce well. They have a hard time conceiving and things like that. It also takes them a long time to reach maturity. We're going to talk about K and R life strategies in the future, and I'll tie back to this. So that's going to be the end of part 1. I'll be back in just a second for part 2.